Okay, so last week we were we've been talking about Joshua, story of Joshua, right? If you remember, we were talking about the story of Jericho and the battle of Ai as well, right? Talked about how our sins, our actions affect other people. We might not see it initially, but it does, right? How during their first conquest, right? The first city they take is the city of Jericho. And oftentimes we talk about the importance of giving our first fruits, giving whether it's a harvest, whether it's the first portion of our paycheck, whatever that looks like, giving first to God, not to ourselves, not to anyone else, but giving God what comes first. And this is that idea in practice. It's the idea that they're going into this land that's going to be massive, right? About the size of New Jersey, land of Canaan, promised land. And as they begin their conquest, taking over nation by nation, city by city, they're going to give the first of that to God. And that's what Jericho was, the first fruits of their conquest, of this story, this chapter. And they were supposed to take all the riches, all the gold, all the silver, and put that in the treasury. But one man, in his lust, in his greed, he got big-eyed. He saw it and he took it for himself. Stuffed it under his tent. That was sin. He wasn't supposed to do that. God said, take all of it and put it in the Lord's treasury. And we saw how when they went to battle at Ai, right? Next city over, the next big battle, Israel loses. And that's because he had sinned. And Joshua goes to God and saying, well, why were we defeated? Essentially. It goes because someone among you took the things that were sacred, took the things that belonged to me. And then we also saw how his entire family was punished for the sin of that one man. And how, whatever it looks like in our lives, we all have sin we're trying to sweep under the rug. We're trying to stuff it under the tent, we're trying to hide it. Whether, we get big-eyed, whether it's the things we say, things we think, maybe we're looking at something we're not supposed to. We all have sin like that. And we might not feel it directly in the moment, right? When he first took the gold and silver, he didn't see the consequences of it right off the bat. But there were consequences to come. And so this week, we're going to talk about another story that has a similar idea. Um, but, so I'm going to kind of summarize this is Joshua, right? Story of Joshua. For the next 20 so chapters that we're not really going to go into depth into because we want to focus on the stories that are here, right? Um, Fix this. Because we do want to focus on these stories. Um, the core characters, right? Is they go through and they end up taking the land of Canaan, right? City by city, the story of Joshua is a military story, right? It's one where they go through and they take over the land of Canaan, the promised land, and it becomes the land of Israel. The same land that is, for the most part, there today. Not in full, because they have never been given back their full land, but it's that same land. Um, then we see here, it came about after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. And so, end of his conquest, right? End of his turn in leadership because he followed after Moses. So where does that leave us? Now that Joshua's story is done, where does it leave us? Well, we follows chronologically still, same timeline, which is the book of Judges. Now, there's a couple ideas you gotta grasp first before going into the book of Judges. For one question I asked is, what is a judge? What do you know a judge to be? Oftentimes, you immediately think of courtroom, you think of a gavel, right? Implement a handle saying guilty, not guilty, sentencing someone to 10 years in prison, that kind of thing. And that's part of the idea. A judge is someone who dictates, right? It's someone who looks at what's there and they judge, they compare, they establish rulings, they lead based on what they judge fit, to use the word again in its own definition. Now, a key thing to understand about the story of Joshua is, like we saw at Jericho. Jericho, they were told to wipe everyone out, kill everyone. Anything that lived, whether it was, man, woman, child, elderly, whether it was an animal, they were told to slaughter everything, which they did. But they didn't always follow through with what God told them to do. A big part of the conquest of Canaan is they were supposed to go through and wipe out everyone. Because once again, God's plan might not make sense, but he knew that these other nations would be a stumbling block to the nation of Israel. Right? Right now, God might be, pointing something to you, and, you might be comfortable with it. You might say, oh, it's not hurting me now. But we're going to see how that affects them. You see, these other nations have other gods. And they will become stumbling blocks. They didn't wipe them all out. And after Joshua, there is no new leader who steps up immediately, right? And so, the key idea I want to give you, it's going to be our main theme as we go through stories of the judges, right? Is they all did what was right in the sight of their own eyes, right? I'm not exactly sure what verse that is. Because it is a fairly common phrase in the book of Judges. So we see a list of cities that were not conquered, right? And these are, like I was just saying, people who they didn't wipe out fully. They didn't remove from the land of Canaan. And then we see Joshua's death. Just recounted again, right? But this is following, the fact that they didn't conquer everyone, right? Now the angel of the Lord came up from Gilgal to Bochum, and he said, I brought you up out of Egypt and led you into the land which I have sworn to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And as for you, you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. They were supposed to wipe them out, right? But you have not obeyed me. What is this you have done? Because we see a list here for, 7 verses, 7, 8, 9 verses, where it's just a whole list of places they had not wiped out, right? The Amorites, so Ephraim, the Canaanites who were living in Gezer, the Kitron, right? All these different people groups that were not wiped out, that they were told, but they did not obey. What is it say you have done? Therefore, I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they will become as thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. When the angel of the Lord spoke these words, all the sons of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept. So they named the place Bochim, and they sacrificed, and there they sacrificed to the Lord. And so you see, we're already seeing the after effects. God is warning them, because you didn't do this, because you didn't follow my instruction fully, there's going to be consequences to it. I'm not punishing you, but understand it's going to affect you in ways you might not have expected. And it's going to hurt. And so we see the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. Baals were the pagan gods, right? Were the gods that those local people were worshiping. And they forsook the Lord, God of the fathers, who brought them out of the land of Egypt, and followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were around them, and bowed themselves down to them. Thus they provoked the Lord's anger. And we're going to see, we see here, you feel free to read the end of chapter 2 here, this introduction to the judges. But we're going to see a cycle, right, where they end up being deceived by another group. They start following the other gods, right? You know, they forsook the Lord and served another god. Let me see. The Lord allowed other nations. They gave them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies around them, so they could no longer stand before the enemies. Right. So he gives them into their sin. He says, "Fine, you're going to turn from me. I'm going to give you into that. I'm going to let you follow that." Then the Lord will raise when they go back to God and they plead to God. You know, when they're distressed, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. And so we're going to see this cycle where they turn from God, right? It always starts with now, whenever you're going through a trial in life, it starts with a turn from God. Somehow, some way, you looked away from what God was telling you to do. They turn from God. They face the consequences. You know, they face trials. It leads them to turn back to God. And God will raise them out of it. He raised leaders, judges, who would lead them back to God. And during the time of each judge, right, these leaders, the time that these leaders were in charge, whether it was a lifetime, whether, you know, whatever period, they followed God. And the minute the judge stepped down from leadership, they passed away, the people went right on back to it. And like I said, they did what was right in the sight of their own eyes. What that means is, like, you're right, my right. We all have what we would feel is right, what's comfortable to us, right? I might be comfortable doing something wrong, but what I feel comfortable saying is right is not always what God says is right. And God's right is objectively right. Right isn't just a matter of perspective, it's absolute. It's something that is absolutely right. And so, starting, the first judge I'm going to talk about is actually a pretty cool one. Starting in chapter 4 of the book of Judges. A person named Deborah, a woman named Deborah. She was a prophetess. She was a female prophet. And the cool thing about this, right, is kind of what I talked about when we talked about Rahab. There aren't, back then, in the historical period of the Bible, women didn't have the same rights, right? Think even 100, 150 years ago, women couldn't vote, women couldn't drive, right? They weren't allowed to work necessarily. They weren't given this. They weren't ever put in positions of leadership, right? The whole reason why the story of Mary When the first person who sees Jesus is Mary, that's a big thing because the women weren't even given credibility. So the fact that her words are put in the Bible, that she saw him, is important. And so whenever there's a female character in the Bible, it shows just how divinely inspired it is, how truthful it is. Because look at any other religion, they'd absolutely never show this kind of thing. They would never give credibility to someone like this if it was truly written when it was written, by who and for what it was. If it wasn't history, if it wasn't accurate, they absolutely would not never record the words of a woman back then. Now, on Wednesday when I covered this, I read through the whole thing. It's a long story, 24 verses. I'm not gonna do that here. I would encourage it though, but I'm just kind of summarize it and go through it. Here's kind of how the story goes, right? Is you have this woman Deborah, right? She's a prophet. God communicates through the prophets to his people. For example, Moses, right? Moses was a prophet. God would tell Moses something, and then Moses would tell the people what God told him. The prophets were the ones who were the in-between between God and God's people, God's chosen people. Well, she was one of those. God told her, on this day, I have given you this nation, Jabin, king of Canaan, right? The hand of, he sold him into his hand. And so God told him, go ahead. If you go to battle with these people, you will win. You will surely win. So she goes and tells the general at the time, and says, hey, this nation has 9,000 chariots. A lot of chariots. Big army. Take only 10,000 men. In comparison, that's a weaker, much weaker army. But go and win. Go, slaughter them. We'll win. We'll win. God has given us this battle. But Barak, right, is the name of the general. He says, I'm not too sure, but if you go with us, then I'll be confident that we'll win. And so she says, okay, I'll go with you. I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the honor shall not be yours on this journey that you are about to take. For the Lord will sell Sisera. Sisera is the king of the other army they're about to take over, right? The Lord will sell Sisera into the hands of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. Now, this is very significant. She's a woman prophetess, right? And we talked about how Leviticus is the book of the law. Well, one of the laws in the book of Leviticus is this. If there is a prophet, someone who claims to be a prophet, who will preach prophecy, right? Will prophesy, right? And they are deemed to be a false prophet. What they say never comes to terms, never comes to be. You are to stone them, kill them. So this is, for someone to share a prophecy like this, it's important. He's saying, God said this, it will happen. That's a prophecy. If she's wrong, the law says she should be stoned. And that's an important thing to understand about who the prophets were. They were credible because their lives were on the line to share what God told them to share. But she goes with them, right? They go down to meet the enemy army, and they meet down at this river. 9,000 chariots against 10,000 men. Then severe storm hits, causes flooding of the river, causes a massive buildup of mud. Not sure if you know, but vehicles like imagine even a bike, and cars even don't work too well in mud. They got stuck in the mud. God can use. God makes his victory his own way. Put it that way, right? You know, so they force to jump. The enemy army is forced to jump off their chariots. They're fleeing. Israel chases after them and slaughtering them one by one to end up wiping them all out. However, the king, this man named Sisera, right? Um, he runs off on foot. He flees away and goes to a tent of a woman named Jael, the wife of Heber. He goes here because it's like he's like, okay, this is Israel, but this is a city in Israel that we have a peace treaty with. So it's safe for me to go here. He goes in, he finds this woman he knows, says, hide me in your tent. So she covers him with a blanket. He says, go stand at the door, and if anyone asks if I'm here, say he's not here. Well, by that point, Sisera, this king, he's fled. He's fighting in a battle. Tired, he falls asleep. While he's sleeping, Jael goes. She takes a tent peg. She takes a hammer, and it says, took a tent peg and seized the hammer from her hand, and went secretly to him, and drove the peg into his temple, and then went through into the ground, while he was sound asleep and exhausted. So he died. That's a harsh image. It really is. But imagine that's not a good way to illustrate this, right? It's not that it just went into his head; it went clean through the other side, right? First off, that takes a lot of force. That takes a lot of So she must have been at least decently strong. But this is the prophecy that Deborah had already, talked about. Forgive me. This is that same prophecy Deborah, talked about. How a woman had the honor, got the glory of being the one who killed the king. What she did wasn't sin, right? She knew what God had told the nation of Israel. She probably knew they were going to war with this nation. She knew who the king was. She knew he was supposed to be killed. And so, taking what she had, using what she had on hand, she obeyed God, kind of like Abraham, in such a severe situation. And the three main things I hope you can get out of this story, that I hope everyone got out of this story. 1, God uses unlikely leaders. I teach every day at on HQ, every Wednesday at HQ. Right. There have been so many nights where I've, afterward I realized to myself, I say to myself, there's no way I should be teaching. I don't know enough. I'm not good enough. I don't follow God enough to be someone who can teach. But God can use anyone. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. It doesn't matter if you're Saul, right? Or you're Paul at this point. It doesn't matter if you're a thief. It doesn't matter how many times you've sinned. Man, woman, man, child. I think Timothy. Don't let someone, look down on you because of your young age. Doesn't matter who you are. God can use anybody for his purposes, for what he has planned. Second, God makes victory his own way. We saw how a mass, in these odds, right, where outside of the Bible, if you presented this, this military battle to a general, they would have told Israel to retreat. You have 10,000 men, you have 9,000 chariots. They are outmatched. The chariots outmatch them. But God uses, has divine ways. If we follow him, think back to Jericho, how another military conquest, they were told, don't bring cannons, don't bring catapults. Just walk around the city, listen to me. Walk around the city, blow your trumpets, and yell. and the wall will come down, and you will have the city. The city will be yours. It makes no sense. Any rational human being would never go out of their way to do that unless they were told by a God to do it, by the God to do it. God can use his divine intervention, right? His way is greater than ours. We don't understand it all the time, but when God's giving you a push to do something, trust it. And third, God honors hidden faithfulness, right? Jael, right, this woman who ended up killing Sisera, she probably wasn't celebrated. She, wasn't probably held in high honor, but her name is recorded in history now, right? Millions of people have read her name and know who she is now. Understand the great deeds she did in God's name because she was faithful. So often I've heard stories, especially during my time at Word of Life, my time in college, where when we follow God, right? We talk about at Albion, we have these kingdom moments, these moments where God pushes us to do things, and times when we actually obey, we call kingdom moments. Whether it's to pray for someone, whether it's to come alongside them and share our faith, whether it's just to go and give $10 to the homeless person we see, who we might not feel comfortable even interacting with. Right? We have these kingdom moments where God rewards those things. If you're faithful, God rewards it. It's incredible because I've heard so many stories of times where you're either planting a seed, or watering a seed, or you're harvesting a seed. Is what we say. It's like God might push you to go and talk to someone, and some random person, like maybe a homeless person on the street, right? Imagine someone sitting there on the corner, and you go and God tells you to go share your faith with someone. And you go share your faith with them, they don't accept you, they don't listen to you, and you never see them again. But little do you know that 5 years from then, 5 years in the future, you're not gonna even recognize them. So they might be a pastor, leading a church of 500 people, leading people to God every day, because your one act of kindness planted a seed in them. It showed them the love of God that they would not have seen otherwise if you had not been faithful. I got to see that all in action in Romania, where I literally shared I heard someone shared their faith with someone, as we were going out through the streets of Romania. They brushed them off, they ignored them. I later came along and shared my faith with them, and they kind of they were kind of I don't want to really hear it, but I might come by, I might come listen at your church. And later that night, I was sharing my testimony in that church. I didn't know that the couple I had talked to was in the church, but they were. They heard my testimony. They felt the love of God just through the multiple acts of kindness, the multiple small acts of faith, right? That no one else saw. But God did a work, and that couple ended up giving their life to Christ that day. So it's those three things. God can use anyone for his purposes. God can, God's way is better. We might not understand it. And when we are faithful in those moments, where it doesn't make sense, it doesn't make any sense to go talk to the homeless person. But it has an impact. There's honor in it. And there's reward in heaven when we do it. And if you missed all of that, if you tuned out and you're in the last couple of seconds here, I want just to emphasize the theme of the book of Judges again. It's everyone did what was right in the sight of their own eyes, right? This is just one cycle where we see a prophetess, a judge step up and lead Israel back into following God. They sing a song. They praise God after this. But right after Deborah steps down, we see that they do what's right inside of their own eyes. They go back to worshiping false gods. They go back to following other nations, other idols, other statues. Everyone did right inside of their own eyes. That's the story of Judges. How everyone has their own perspective, their own desires. And when we follow that, it leads to destruction. But we're always one step back. It doesn't matter how many steps you take away from God, it's always one step back. Amen.